My sister and I grew up together as two completely normal girls. Now she is 26 years old and I am 24. But for the last 10 years, every weekend I have to visit her in a mental health center, where she has been confined ever since. I guess you're wondering what is the reason why my sister ended up in that place, and I would love to be able to give you a concrete answer about it. But the truth is that what happened to her specifically is something that to this day is a complete mystery to everyone. But it all started after a strange incident that took place one summer afternoon in the summer of 2013 that changed our lives forever. At the time, Brianna was 16 years old and I had just turned 14. My father is an architect, so we were constantly traveling due to his work. Our mother passed away when Brianna and I were little girls, this after years of battling breast cancer, and since then we had no one else in our care. It was just me, my sister, and my dad. However, Dad always managed to take care of us and give us a good life. Once, he was assigned a new project to redesign an old abandoned house into a hotel. It was a very ambitious project and the pay was very good. The problem was that the house was in another city and the project would take several years to execute, so we had to move, at least temporarily, to that city. In order to start the project as soon as possible, the real estate company arranged for us to stay in a small house near the old one, and within a week we moved into this new house. The old abandoned house was at the back of our new home and could be seen in all its splendor from my sister's room. The first thing I noticed when I arrived was that the old house was really huge and spectacular. More than a house, it was a big mansion that in its glory years must have been the splendid place in the whole town, but it was in very bad shape now. The second thing that surprised me, but not pleasantly, was that this was a country area where there was a lot of land and forest. When my dad told us that we were moving to this town, I was very excited because this was a much bigger and more modern city than ours. But it turned out that the house was located in a small farming town on the outskirts of the metropolis. This change had a significant impact on our lives because we also had to change schools due to the long-distance problem. And while my father and Brianna seemed very excited about moving to this new place, I was not happy at all. I missed my friends and the country life became too boring for me. Besides, I don't know why that old abandoned house gave me a bad vibe from the first day I saw it. However, as time went by, things took shape. In the morning, Dad used to go to the old house with his group of workers and take care of his work, while Brianna and I went to school. Our school was a 15-minute walk from our house, and we used to ride our bikes. My sister had always been outgoing and good at making friends, so she got along with all her new classmates very easily and quickly became very popular. I made a few friends too, but I never went beyond being just another random girl. However, it was just this quest for popularity of Brianna's that triggered the chilling events that transformed her mind and marked our lives forever. One day, I was sitting alone at school when I overheard two girls talking right next to me. One blonde girl was saying to the other girl, "You know, Brianna said we could go party at her house. She said the party would be at the old abandoned house near where she lives, and that her dad is also going out of town this weekend." I was a little surprised that my sister would invite her friends to a party without even asking Dad's permission. On the way home, I asked her, "Why are you going to party with your friends at the old house, and when do you plan to tell Dad?" She looked at me with uncomfortable eyes and said, Yes, I am planning a party, but please don't tell Dad, Ava. This is a nice opportunity to become more popular, you know." I replied worriedly, "Brianna, I don't think it's a good idea. That house gives me the creeps. Besides, if Dad finds out about this, he's going to be very upset." Brianna laughed and said, "Oh, relax. If you promise not to tell Dad, I'll get you a beer on the sly. Are you okay?" And again, she started laughing as she rode her bike past me. I kept quiet, not because of the beer, but because she was happy and excited, and I hadn't seen her like that in a while, but I still felt worried. Dad was gone for 3 days to inspect a new property that would be paid for by the realtor. But before he left, he told us not to go out after 7 p.m. and that no friends were allowed in the house. Be good for the next 3 days. I will call often to see how you're doing, okay? Be careful, and if there are any setbacks, call me right away. Then she hugged us and left. I still regret not telling him about Brianna's plan that morning. God knows if I had, I would have saved her from the horrible incident that was about to happen. The next day when we were at school, my sister was planning the party with a couple of friends. I was standing there with her when I saw that she invited 6 or 7 people. After we got home, Brianna said, "Let's go, Ava." "Where to?" I said in surprise. She replied, "To the house, silly. We have a lot of work to do. I need to clean and decorate the place for the party tonight." Even though I wasn't planning on going into that house ever, my sister forced me to do it anyway. As I walked in, the first thing I noticed was that Dad had done an extraordinary job with the living room. The floor was new and so were the walls. The house finally looked to be in good condition, or at least from the inside. But as soon as I took the first step, a shiver ran down my spine. It was a summer evening, but I don't know why I was cold inside the house. My sister came in normally, turned to me standing in the doorway, looked at me with worried eyes and said, "What happened? Come on, we have to hurry." It was only then that I unfroze and started walking. We started putting on some chains and tuned in the music player as we began to clean the couches and the floor. A staircase on the right led me to the upstairs bedrooms. I climbed the stairs and saw that the second floor was worn and out of use. The repair work had not yet begun there. There was a dirty, torn curtain hanging from the window at the end of the hallway, and it looked really creepy. I was standing there when suddenly I felt as if someone was breathing down my neck. I immediately turned around, but no one was there. I didn't tell my sister about this incident because I knew she wouldn't believe me and would just make fun of me for being scared. That night we arrived home around 8 p.m., and a few minutes later, 2 cars pulled up near our driveway. I watched from my window as my sister and her friends went to the abandoned house to party. Brianna turned to me and waved. I waved back and smiled at her, but only on the outside because inside I was tremendously worried. I lay on my bed and kept thinking about the sinister forebodings I felt in that house. I have no idea when I fell asleep, but suddenly I was awakened by a loud scream. I recognized the voice immediately. It was Brianna. I ran to the abandoned house to see what had happened. It was already 12 midnight, but before I could get inside, I saw 2 or 3 people carrying my fainting sister out of the house. They took her to her room and laid her on the bed. Brianna was completely unconscious, and when I asked the blonde girl what happened to my sister, she replied in a strained voice, "We don't know, Ava." Brianna went upstairs for a minute and then we heard her screaming very loudly. We didn't see what happened, but we assumed that something scared her very much and she fainted. At that point, I was all alone in the house and had no idea what to do. Seeing me so distressed, one of the guys in the group said, "Don't worry, she'll be fine in the morning. She probably got drunk and had hallucinations in that old house. Just let her sleep. If you need help, call one of us, we'll come over then." After that, everyone left. That night I didn't call my dad because I was already feeling too guilty about withholding information from him. Brianna slept through the night, but after that, my sister was never the same. As soon as she woke up the next morning, she began to transform into a completely different person. She stopped going out, stopped talking, and just sat by her bedroom window looking out at the abandoned house all day. My dad and I were scared to see her strange behavior, but in the following days, it only got worse. Brianna started whispering like a maniac, looking at the house as if she was singing something at super speed. Sometimes she would even laugh to herself as if she was talking to someone. Desperate and bewildered by my sister's sudden behavior, my dad called one of his friends who was a psychiatrist to examine her. He conducted a therapy session with Brianna, but before the session could end, she jumped off the couch and bit a piece of flesh from the doctor's neck and started laughing like a lunatic. It was an extremely cruel and shocking sight for me. I cannot describe how terrifying it was to see the piece of flesh covered in blood hanging from her mouth, and her eyes got so big that they looked like they were going to pop out of their sockets at any moment. Every time we consulted a doctor, she would start behaving violently. My dad couldn't sleep at night. We were tense and scared all the time, and there seemed to be no way to cure whatever had happened to my sister. Throughout this whole process, I was eating away at myself with guilt, until one day I just couldn't take it anymore and told my dad about the party at the abandoned house and everything that happened that night. Dad was furious and started to scold me for keeping it from him all this time. That night we were arguing in the living room until we heard a strange chewing sound coming from Brianna's room. We ran upstairs to the room, and when we opened the door, my heart dropped to my stomach. Brianna was eating a dead rat sitting on the floor. At that moment, I couldn't tell if it was my sister or some possessed creature. She looked at us and started whispering something incoherent. Her eyes were moving frantically and then suddenly turned inward and went completely blank. It was absolutely creepy to see my sister stand like a dog with completely white eyes. At that moment, I screamed in terror and ran to my room. My dad called the paramedics, and after about half an hour, they arrived at the house and took my sister away. She was tightly bound with a stretcher, as if they had trapped a wild animal. Brianna was screaming and cursing like a maniac, and the worst thing was that the doctors couldn't figure out what happened to her. I just think she suddenly went crazy. But I knew it had something to do with the house. It broke my heart to see my sister in that condition, but there was nothing more we could do for her. In the days that followed, I searched for everything that had to do with the house and gathered as much information as I could about it. That's how I learned that the previous owner was an old lunatic. His children left him there to die in his old age, and in his last days, the old man used to scream and curse at every human being he saw. The local people told me that he was so violent that no one could enter the house, not even to bring him food and water. The old man would eat anything he could get his hands on, and even drank his own pee. After I found out about this, I have repeatedly told my dad that we should perform an exorcism on my sister, but he doesn't believe me. It's like he doesn't care what I say after I hid what happened that night from him. But one day, maybe out of anger or frustration, my dad set fire to the abandoned house. This got him fired from his job, and he received a lawsuit from his employers. This left us broke, and he now lives with one of his old friends in his house. Meanwhile, I have been studying and working ever since to get on with my life. I only see my dad when we go to visit Brianna, but although she is no longer violent, she rarely says a word, just looks out of her bedroom window all the time. I am an extremely curious person. I can't help but want to know everything when something interests me. However, after that day, I understood the meaning of that old saying, "Curiosity killed the cat," like never before. I was in high school when all this happened. One day I found out that there was an old, abandoned building within walking distance of my house. I had recently acquired a very particular taste for exploring abandoned places in the city, which had made me famous among the kids at my school. This curiosity for exploring building ruins came to me after watching a video on YouTube, and then it happened to me like when someone discovers their calling in life. It was like a puff, and I knew right away that I wanted to start doing this in my own city. At that point, I had already explored an abandoned school, a church, and several houses. But after learning about this building, My curiosity to get there only increased every day. At the same time, I felt that by doing this, I would have a very funny story to tell people, as if I would become everyone's favorite. It was out of this curiosity that I convinced my friends, Liam, Charlie, and Elvis, to come with me. At first, Elvis didn't want to come with us, but after nagging him a couple of times, he finally agreed. We finally convinced him that it would be a wonderful experience and that it would be a good story to tell for the rest of his life. One day we agreed to go after school the next day, because it was a bit tiring to walk there, as the building was deep in the thick forest that enveloped the city. We got there after almost 2 hours of walking, but when we had the building in front of us, we knew it had been worth every step. The place was huge and imposing. It was a beautiful mansion from the 20s, really impressive. Its walls were immense, but they were very dirty and worn, as expected. There were trees on top and cracks in many places. Most of the windows were broken, but we still couldn't see anything inside. After a few seconds, we jumped out of a window and landed next to the stairs, which were just like the rest of the house, dirty and in very bad shape. But somehow we managed to use them, although we first explored the entire first floor, looked through the old furniture and realized that practically everything was intact, or rather in the same place it was when the house was abandoned. The furniture was still covered with sheets, only they were old and full of mold. Likewise, the glass and wood dining room had all its chairs complete and in place, and even had a vase in the center, whose flowers had died a long time ago, and were now just a dark and smelly mass at the bottom of the vase. There were also pictures all over the house, some of them just decorative, while a couple showed the image of a family, father, mother, and 2 children, but they were in such a bad state that it was practically impossible to distinguish their faces. Only some details like the clothes and the fact that they were posing as families usually do for a portrait, which let you know that it was a family portrait. Besides, in my research previous to the exploration, I learned that this house belonged to a mafioso who had fled the country in the late 80s and died in exile, but I found nothing about his family. I guess they fled with him, maybe at the same time or later. Of all the places we explored, there was one that particularly caught my attention, and this was the kitchen, because although it was as deteriorated as the rest of the house, this one looked like a small time capsule. All the utensils were inside the drawers. There were pots, plates, and even supplies inside the pantry. Canned food, obviously rusty and expired for many years. In fact, by the date that I could read on a label that I found in medium good condition, the house must have had at least 40 years abandoned, so it was very strange that everything was still in place, since in this time this house must have been explored many times. I had explored several buildings with a similar date of abandonment, but in those cases there was a lot of clutter and visible signs of previous looting. Instead, this house was intact, as if it had never been explored before, or as if those who had explored it in the past were there for a very short period of time, enough to leave no traces of their incursion into the place. But while I was there, I had a strange sensation. I felt as if someone was watching me from a corner. I could even swear I saw a silhouette. I immediately turned towards that place, but there was no one there. However, as crazy as it sounds, it was as if I could feel their presence there. Starting to get chills, I decided to leave the kitchen and look for the boys who were poking around in various parts of the living room. After exploring the downstairs part of the house, we decided it was time to head upstairs to the bedrooms. As I told you before, the stairs were made of wood and were very dilapidated, so we had to climb very carefully and one at a time to keep the steps from crumbling under our feet. Upon entering the hallway, we immediately noticed 2 things. The first was that this area was a little more deteriorated than the one downstairs, and the second was that there was a rather foul odor that spread throughout the hallway. On the other hand, I was still feeling that unsettling sensation of being watched. but I didn't say anything to my companions so that they wouldn't make fun of me. At one point, we stopped to look at a small shelf with trophies that was just down the hall. That's when we heard a loud noise behind us. We all turned around in unison with our hearts racing, only to find that idiot Elvis laughing his ass off from the scare he gave us. Liam, Charlie, and I looked at him angrily, as the noise was due to him slamming a door hard, and the last thing we wanted at that moment was for anyone around to hear us and get us in trouble for trespassing on private property. After our little altercation with Elvis, we started looking inside the rooms. This was something we tried to do in a hurry because of the strong odor. We assumed it was a dead animal, something we could corroborate when we got to the third room, where there was indeed the corpse of some kind of dog or wolf lying on the side of the bed, which must have been there for a long time. We decided not to explore this room, as the smell was too unbearable, so we closed the door and went on. The house was so huge that on that floor there were 6 rooms, arranged facing each other along the corridor. As we explored them, we found nothing too interesting, just beds spread out and closets with old, moth-bitten clothes, and I was already beginning to get bored, when suddenly something unexpected happened. We heard another loud knock coming from one of the rooms we had already checked. At that moment, we were in one of the penultimate rooms and Elvis was with us, so we knew it wasn't him this time. A couple of seconds passed and we started to hear footsteps in the hallway, followed by the sound of a door being slammed shut. We were scared out of our wits, thinking someone else was in the house. We carefully left the room and headed towards the room where the noise had been heard, opened the door and got a very frightening surprise. On the back wall there was a large writing in red letters that said, "Get out of here." There was no one around, nor did we hear the footsteps of anyone coming down the stairs or going anywhere else. But that was not even the most frightening thing. But the writing was made with a very thin line, and next to it was the imprint of a small hand, which looked like a child of 7 or 8 years old. It was as if a small child had written this sentence with a finger full of blood. At this moment our blood froze, as we had just entered that room and this writing was definitely not there. We looked at each other very puzzled, and without saying a word we started to slowly withdraw from the room. When we were in the hallway, we began to deliberate about leaving the house right then and there, or exploring some more. Actually, we had a couple of rooms and other places left to explore. I wanted to continue exploring and photographing despite what had happened, but my companions were peeing their pants and wanted to leave. So I told them to go downstairs while I took a look at the rooms at the end and then caught up with them. Liam and Charlie disagreed, while Elvis hadn't finished hearing the verdict, as he was already going downstairs. In the end, Charlie and Liam said they would wait for me in the living room, but please don't delay me, and started down the stairs. When I think about it now, I realize how foolish I was. For while what happened in the first room gave me chills, my curiosity was even more tenacious than the fear I felt when I saw that phrase written in fresh blood on the wall, with no explanation for it. I walked to the end of the hallway and opened the door to the penultimate room, left it open and began to shine my flashlight and take some pictures standing under the doorframe. That was all I planned to do. As I already had pictures of the whole house, I was only missing these couple of rooms, the attic and the basement. But I didn't plan to go there, as I knew my companions would kill me if I proposed to enter those places. After all, basements and attics are terrifying in themselves. While I was taking a couple of pictures, something caught my attention, and I began to hear a kind of sobbing coming from a corner of the room, which I could not see from where I was because the bed covered it. At that moment, I began to feel much more strongly the sensation that accompanied me throughout my exploration in that house, and that is that I felt the presence of a person, and I felt that this person was watching me. I debated between going downstairs, catching up with my friends, and running away from the place, or going into the room and seeing who was there. As you can imagine, my curiosity won out again, so I did the latter. I took a couple of steps into the room and immediately felt the door slam shut behind me. I turned and grabbed the handle to open it, but it was completely sealed. Suddenly, the sobbing I heard at first slowly turned into loud crying, and then into screams of terror and suffering. I was frozen and mute with panic. I felt a shiver run through me from head to toe, and my heart began to beat like a drum inside my chest. This was the cry of a boy or girl, and suddenly I began to hear a loud, deep male voice. This voice was aggressive and shouted angry insults, which were followed by dry heaves and cries of pain from the child. It was absolutely terrifying, chilling, and very desperate at the same time. I started to look in all directions, but there was nothing. The room was completely empty. But I could hear the voices, the screams, the blows. While I felt a tremendous helplessness for not being able to do anything, it was clear that this was a heartbreaking scene of child abuse, and having been a child myself who was abused by his stepfather at one point in my life, it was all too overwhelming. These sounds continued for a few seconds and became louder and more painful, to the point where I fell to my knees on the floor, crying with my eyes squeezed shut and screaming as I covered my ears with my hands in an attempt to silence the torment. When suddenly, from one moment to the next, everything went silent. After a few seconds, I opened my eyes and stood up again, feeling my body trembling, and still with my heart racing. I wiped my tears and looked up, and then terror invaded me completely. On the wall in front of the bed was written once again in blood the phrase, "I told you to get out of here." I took a couple of steps, and as if someone had ordered me, I turned my eyes towards the corner where I had heard the sobs in the first place, and what I saw there would haunt me for life. Like everything I lived inside that cursed house. In that corner, in a fetal position, was a small skeleton covered with what looked like a small tattered and rotten dress by the action of mold, which also surrounded the small body and extended over part of the floor and the wall. From the state it was in, it must have been there for many, many years, as the bones were dry and there was no trace of flesh on them, not even a rotten smell, but rather mold and dampness. At that moment I began to hear knocks on the door, or rather, I paid attention to the knocks on the door because now that I remembered I had been hearing them for a while, but with the din of the screams and everything that happened in the room a moment ago, they were in the background for me and I ignored them completely. On the other side, I could make out the voices of my friends calling out to me and struggling with the handle to try to open the door, when suddenly, the door swung open. My friends entered the room almost stumbling. They looked very distressed and began to ask me what was going on and if I was all right, since they had heard my screams downstairs. It was then when, without saying a word, I pointed to the corner, and they saw completely terrified the small skeleton lying there. That same night we called the police and they entered the house and removed the body. Curiously, when the security forces arrived, the writings with blood on the walls had disappeared. A few days later, we learned the story behind the small body found in the house. It was an unsolved crime from 30 years ago. The skeleton was that of a 7-year-old girl named Amanda, who was the daughter of a merchant living in the neighboring town. The girl disappeared without a trace in 1992 and was never found, just as her captor was never found. Her parents had already passed away, but she had 2 brothers, who were notified and went to pick up her body to give her a dignified burial. Knowing this story broke my heart. The subsequent autopsy showed that the cause of death was multiple stab wounds, and it is presumed that the perpetrator abused her before finally murdering her. However, this did not come as a surprise to me, because all the horrors that little Amanda suffered she herself showed me in that room, but that is something I never talked about with anyone. I simply felt that to relate this was to relive it, and I didn't think I could bear it. I remembered the writings on the walls and knew that these were surely her attempts to warn us to get out of there. Maybe she wanted to save us from her killer. As you can imagine, that was my last exploration of an abandoned building. After that terrifying experience, I was never again curious to visit a ruined place. I can only take solace in knowing that, while justice was never served in Amanda's case, at least her body was found, and her family was able to have closure. My name is Joshua. I am 17 years old and I live in Australia. This story took place about 3 years ago and involved my best friend, whose name I don't want to mention out of respect for his privacy, and myself. For the purposes of the story, we are going to call my friend Daniel. Daniel and I always get into a lot of mischief when we are together. The problems we cause range from the typical ding-dong on other people's doors to public vandalism. There have been a few instances where we've been chased by the police and everything. It's just that we cause trouble and have fun doing it. When my friend and I were about 14 years old, we went to my aunt's farm in Queensland. She had a beautiful farmhouse surrounded by a large sugarcane crop. My aunt's house was actually big and cozy, but my friend and I wanted to camp outside in a tent. One night, when I was younger, I was with my family at a barbecue and my uncle told us about a house on top of a big hill not far away, which was abandoned and supposedly haunted. That night I remembered that story and asked my uncle specifically where it was. He was a little surprised by my question, but then pointed us to where it was. My friend and I looked at each other, and we both knew what we had to do. We were going to go the next day. We wanted to investigate this haunted house. The next morning, he and I grabbed our backpacks and packed the essentials for an adventure: a pocket knife, a flashlight, warm clothes, some snacks, and so on. We told my aunt we were going for a bike ride, and she said, "Okay, just take care of yourselves and stay out of trouble. I don't want to hear any complaints from other people on the farm about your shenanigans." We assured her we would behave, so we grabbed our bikes and our bags and left. This was a very hot day, so biking up the hill was really tiring. We were too tired to carry the bikes up the steep hill, so we left them at the bottom and walked up. Once we got to the top and had a clear view of the house, I felt nauseous and sat down for a while so I could rest. The truth is that I was expecting a big country house with lots of nooks and crannies to explore, but the truth is that the house was very small, only 1 story high. Finally, I felt better and we walked to the front door of the cottage. To be honest, you wouldn't think it was abandoned. None of the windows were broken and it looked stable, although we couldn't see inside because the windows were boarded up from inside the building. We were very curious, so curious that in the end, my friend and I did something very, very stupid. We threw rocks at the windows so we could remove the boards and get inside. This hill was pretty isolated from the town. There was basically nothing but trees and brush around, so we didn't think anyone would see us, as the house itself was also abandoned. Who would care if someone broke a couple of windows in an uninhabited house? Once we broke all the windows, we kicked and punched the boards out, and one by one all the boards were left lying on the floor. I don't know why, but for some reason or another we decided to break all the windows and remove all the boards instead of just one. We probably thought it was fun to break things, like the stupid teenagers we were. The thing is, with all the boards out of the window frames, quite a bit of light was coming in and we could see the inside of the house better. We crawled through a window and could now see everything very clearly. The layout of the house was very simple. The living room was connected to the kitchen and there was a bedroom and a bathroom. But what we saw in these spaces confused us. All the cupboards and drawers were full of utensils, dishes, bowls, pans, books, paintings, and so on. However, this place was supposed to have been abandoned for a long time. Once again, like the stupid teenagers we were, my friend and I made yet another dumb decision. We started throwing rocks at the cabinets and emptied all the drawers, broke plates, glasses, and basically completely trashed the place. In one of the drawers, we found cool board games, books, cards, and stuff like that. Then we went to the only room in the house and found a picture of a family. In the drawer, there was an old man, an old woman, a boy and a girl who was wearing a light green dress, had very long dark brown hair. The strange thing was that the girl was not close to everyone else. The old man, the woman, and the boy were together and smiling, but the girl was to the left and far behind. We thought that was odd. We also saw that something was written on the back of the picture, and my friend thought it would be funny if he tore the picture into pieces. This made me a little uncomfortable, as I thought the image seemed to have emotional value to whoever owned it. That was my line of thinking, but I decided to keep quiet because I didn't want to be a spoilsport. So I told him that was fine. Yes, that's what I wanted, and started laughing, thinking I was all bad boy. My friend carried out his new little act of vandalism, but as he started to rip the picture, we heard a faint chant coming from outside. It was a girl's voice. My friend and I looked at each other, and we were both quite quizzical now. Daniel told me to go to the front window and take a look. I was scared, so I didn't want to, but eventually my friend obliged. It's funny how we ended up getting trashed property that didn't belong to us without any fear, and now we were scared of a girl humming a song. After debating for a moment with Daniel about which of us should go take a look, I finally slowly walked over to the window and looked out. For a moment, I really thought it was a ghost or something, but in fact there was someone outside and they were singing, but it didn't look like a ghost at all, but a flesh and blood girl. However, there was something about her that really caught my attention, and that was that she was a girl about 11 years old wearing a green dress and had dark brown hair. She looked exactly like the girl in the picture. How could this 11-year-old girl who was singing in front of me have a picture of her from 1977? I froze in fear. I ran away from her when I heard Daniel whisper to me, "Dude, what's going on? What do you see?" I turned around and crawled on all fours back to where my friend was, trying to be as quiet as possible. I told him what I saw, and at first he didn't believe me. He said it wasn't even funny and to stop making those tasteless jokes. But I assured him that what I was saying was completely true, but he remained stubborn and said, "Take a picture, and I'll believe you." I asked him why he didn't go out and look himself, but he said he didn't want to because he was scared too. At least he was honest in admitting it. I listened to my friend and decided to go out and take a picture of the girl. So I took out my phone and opened the camera, crawled on all fours back to the window, and as I was about to take the picture, she slowly stopped, turned around, and let out an incredibly loud scream as she pointed at me, and then jumped backwards off the hill. I dropped my phone and ran to my friend. I felt so nauseous that I threw up right there. When Daniel saw me, he started asking me, "Bro, what happened? What was that scream? Why are you throwing up?" He was very scared and desperate, but it took me a while to get a grip, and it was only after I was able to come to my senses that I told him what I had just seen, and to my utter surprise, he believed me. We stayed in that house for quite a while, feeling too scared to leave in case that girl was still there. We sat there in the middle of the room in complete silence for about 2 or 3 hours, until we heard a car approaching the house. A few minutes later, we heard the sound of the car door opening and then a loud male voice shouting, "We know you two are in there. Get out before we go in." It was the cops. We didn't know what to do or who had alerted them to our incursion into that house. We thought maybe it had been the girl, so we quickly began to hatch a plan to get out of this without being arrested. After wandering through all our options, which clearly weren't too many, we decided that when the cops came through the front door, we would run out the window, go around the house and down the hill. We did just that. Once the cops finally came through the front door kicking it down, Then we jumped out the back window, ran around the left side of the house and down the hill in a straight line to our bikes. Once we got our bikes, we got away pretty quickly, because the cops turned their car off and had to turn it back on to turn around and follow us. But by the time they did, Daniel and I had already started our way back to my aunt's house. When we finally got inside the house and were safe, we didn't speak at once, as we were both traumatized by the whole situation. When we finally got inside the house and were safe, we didn't speak at once, as we were both traumatized by the whole situation. For several hours we were nervous and expectant, thinking that at any moment the police would arrive at the house and arrest us, but fortunately that didn't happen. Later that day we talked to my uncle again about the house, and then he admitted that what he said about the house was not 100% true. His original story that the house was haunted was just to scare us, as there was no indication that it really was, but that it just wasn't being used. He said it was a vacation home that foreigners could rent for their visits to this part of Australia, but no one used that house because everyone said it was haunted. But this belief arose from events that happened in that house many, many years ago. Supposedly, this house has belonged to the same family since the 1920s. An elderly couple lived there from about 1940 to 1977, when that elderly couple brought their grandchildren to stay there for a weekend. There was a boy and a girl, but the girl had a mental illness, bipolar disorder according to reports. The girl was said to have murdered everyone in that house, and then committed suicide by jumping off the hill. Upon hearing this story, Daniel and I were shocked, and a sense of dread came over us. We stayed up all night talking about that day. We both realized that the girl we saw in the house was the same girl my aunt told us about. To this day, we have never told anyone about this story, but whenever I visit my aunt, I can't help but look up at the hill and think that the ghost of that little girl still haunts that place. My boyfriend and I were looking for a place to skateboard, and I knew there was an abandoned school nearby. I know, it's not exactly a place to skateboard, but we liked skating more for the views than for the tricks. It was something we did just to relax. We weren't there to be professional skateboarders or anything, if you know what I mean. The thing is that we both found it very interesting to go explore this place, where we were told there was a skating rink. So we thought it was interesting to have this kind of abandoned house experience, but in a school in this case. We decided to go at night to add to the suspense, and also so that no one would see us and end up calling the police. That night we arrived at the place at about 9 p.m., and as we were parking, we noticed that there was a larger parking lot in the back. We got out of the car, entered through an opening in the wire mesh that covered much of the surroundings, and saw that there was indeed a skating rink and also a field area inside the school premises. But instead of staying there and starting to skate as we had originally planned, we decided to walk around this abandoned rink, and when we approached the school, we noticed that there were some kids on the roof playing, but then they left, probably because it was already late, so logically, they had to go back to their homes. We took a look around the building to browse as planned, as the doors were padlocked and there was no way to get inside. After a walk around, we were ready to return to the rink to finally start skating. However, this plan changed radically when we saw that one of the windows had blown open due to the action of the breeze, surely. At this moment, an idea lit up my head. I had always wanted to explore an abandoned building, and I simply couldn't say no to the opportunity that had clearly presented itself in front of me. My boyfriend was suspicious of the idea and told me that maybe it was a bad idea to enter that school without permission, and at this time of night, since we could get into trouble. But I told him that we were already there, and if we were getting into trouble, from the very moment we crossed the gate, we were already in trouble. He insisted and said we should go back to the parking lot and finish skating. but I convinced him to come inside with me and explore the inside of the school. After all, it was exciting and it would be a good story to tell. So we put our skateboards back in the car, and before going back to the building, my boyfriend took a baseball bat he had in his car, and it turned out he also had a flashlight. So he took those two things for protection, and we headed towards the school. We immediately went in through the window that had been broken. There were some signs that other people had been there, but not as squatters or homeless people, more like kids who found a place to smoke and do their thing. As it turned out, we were on our own, so we were able to explore almost at our own pace and have fun while doing so. I would say the creepiest part of this adventure, up to that point, was how untouched everything was. But that wasn't all that surprising either, being that the school was recently abandoned, about 3 or 4 years ago at the time we went in to explore. This was a Catholic school that had a significant student enrollment, so it wasn't quite clear why it closed so suddenly, because literally it was like they just woke up one day and decided that they had to close. Basically, one day they closed the doors and didn't open them anymore. They sent notices to the student body representatives and notified them that the institution would not be incorporated for the new school term. Regarding this, there are different hypotheses. Many said that something spooky had happened inside the facilities of that school. Other versions pointed out that there were administrative irregularities, and the authorities forced the institution to close its doors, while another speculation that was rumored about the place was that it was haunted and that supposedly there were several children had reported having encounters with some sinister figure, besides hearing strange noises and, in general, experiencing paranormal events, which made many parents no longer wanted to enroll their children in that school. Whatever the real reason the school closed its doors and was abandoned, the truth is that it must have been something very sudden, because they basically left everything behind. Without taking much of anything, they even left most of the electricity on, so we had some lighting. We had a lot of fun looking at the desks and finding pictures of teachers with their families and students in classes. There were all kinds of rooms full of things we looked at. In the band room, all the trophies the school band had won were still there. The prop closet in the gym area was full of stuff. All the balls, soccer goals, pads, and all the sporting goods that used to be used in that area, everything was there intact. The auditorium was also full of props and pictures of older choirs. One of my favorites was without a doubt a science classroom. There they had left chemicals, scalpels, test tube, and even a couple of microscopes that were on a shelf. There were a lot of scientific instruments and materials in the place, which, as with everything in the building, were just left there. The truth is that it seemed like a waste to me, since many of those things we found inside the school facilities were perfectly useful and could be put to good use by other children. After finishing with the science area, we decided to head towards the main office. There, in one of the drawers of the principal's desk, we found the keys to each room of the building, along with a map of the whole school. This was a very lucky find, since this map could help us to go around the whole school and enjoy the experience much more. It was totally surreal, but it was amazing, and you definitely get excited when you go to these types of places. There was an area of the cathedral with confession rooms. Going into one of those was pretty creepy, I confess. There was a very heavy vibe in this place. It felt like a kind of darkness that we hadn't felt anywhere else in the building. There were several times when we thought we heard something and our hearts would stop. Then we would think about how we would escape or hide if someone was here and chasing us. While I was in one of the confessionals, my boyfriend was outside holding the baseball bat and flashlight. He was literally dead nervous the whole time. This time he was the one who thought he was hearing strange noises. But I had no idea about these noises because I was so fascinated with all the things I was exploring that my attention was completely on it. But he insisted that I didn't have a good feeling about it. And the truth is, as I said before, you could feel the energy in this place. In this place, you could feel a different energy. And that made me remember something that I had heard some time ago about this school. but I never gave it much credibility. And that is that at some point there was a rumor that the priest who served the school supposedly had abused several children, and when he was discovered, he took his own life by hanging himself in this same room. Some claimed that this was the real reason for the sudden closing of the school, and that the reason this fact was not reported in the press was because the Dreams paid a large sum of money to cover it up. However, this is something that there was no record of, but now that I was there feeling that energy shift, I couldn't help but think that maybe there was some truth to these claims. As I was thinking about that, I began to hear a sound like doors being opened and slammed shut. I turned to look at my boyfriend, and he was standing there, gripping his baseball bat tighter than you can imagine, and looking at me with a panicked expression. He started repeating to me that we had to get out of there as soon as possible, because we were really not welcome and could run into someone unpleasant, or worse yet, something we wanted to see. The noises of doors stopped for a moment, and at that moment I knew he was right. But just as we were leaving the confessional to get out of the school, we suddenly started to hear banging coming from the ceiling. It scared the hell out of me, and my boyfriend immediately started saying, "I knew we shouldn't have done this. Now look what's happening. This place is haunted." He braced himself and literally threw the baseball bat over his shoulder like he was ready to hit whoever it was, at which point I was starting to get seriously worried, and we realized that we had dropped the key we had taken from the main office, the one that opened practically every door. As is obvious at this point, exploration had taken a back seat, and our priority now was to get out of there as soon as possible. And as we thought about it, the knocking got closer and louder. We didn't know what the hell this was or what was causing it, but it felt like the ceiling was being hit by something, and as we ran out of the cathedral section and into the school corridor, these thumps on the ceiling followed us all the way down the hallway. These noises now turned into what sounded like a huge buffalo stomping across the top of the building. This was super strange and very scary. Eventually, we started hearing voices. They were like whispers, but a lot of them, it sounded like a bunch of kids talking at the same time, but in a low way, like they were praying or something, but everything they were saying was incomprehensible. Plus, the school was completely empty, so this was impossible. My boyfriend and I kept running, and I started screaming in panic as the noises intensified while he was breathing heavily, and I had literally never seen him so scared in my life. He was looking around in all directions, trying to figure out which way we came in. We knew it was through the broken window towards the entrance of the school, just past the science labs, but somehow he had forgotten where we were, and since I was terrified too, I was simply following him. He was the one with the baseball bat after all. I, on the other hand, had no chance of fighting anyone. As we continued to try to find the broken window we entered through, we realized that we definitely didn't want to get trapped here. So if we didn't find the window soon, we had to find an alternative. The problem was that the doors surrounding the building had been locked since the school closed 3 or 4 years ago, but they were actually in very good condition, and it was only the fact that the window was broken that meant we were able to get in there in the first place. All the doors were still in perfect condition, and it seemed that no one had even tried to break them to get in. This was bad, very bad, as now. At this point, the knocking was getting louder and louder, and the voices were getting closer and closer. As we desperately searched for the way to the entrance and the broken window, we finally saw in the distance a space where the moonlight seemed to seep through. It was then that we realized that this was the damned window that had been evading us all this time, so we ran towards it at full speed. When we finally got there, my boyfriend dropped the bat and flashlight and then threw himself through the window, giving himself a bump as he landed badly on the other side. But he immediately got up and helped me by grabbing my hand and giving me almost like a knee up through the window. Finally, we were out of that hellish place, and when we finally got to the parking lot ready to get the hell out and never come back, we looked up at the roof of the building to face whatever was there. Then we get a horrible surprise. The kids who were there when we arrived had now returned and were looking at us, laughing their asses off as they ran and jumped all over the roof doing parkour. It was them. It was them all the time making a joke of lousy tastes, while my boyfriend and I were almost scared out of our wits. I really felt like going back there and giving them what they deserved, but instead, I thought about how stupid we were and how well these brats played to give us such a scare, and the truth is that I thought it was very funny, and I started laughing out loud. Then my boyfriend followed me, and we were laughing about it for a while. In the end, we took out our boards and went skating, just as we had planned before I had the brilliant idea of entering the building. No doubt this will be a good story to tell.